Study, yeah.
So I don't know if it was interference from something.
Okay.
So they were running out, putting off my screen.
Okay.
So you could just hang out until it starts doing it. We didn't try to.
Is Kent in the room by chance? So we should get started again. We're actually going to give back 5 minutes when we start, because all we're going to say is the note well, because that's the minimum intro we're required to do.
Oh, you're going to do it already? That was it?
So here is our note well, and maybe we can get people to start coming back in.
One comment about blue sheets. We're going to use the same blue sheets from last session. So if you already signed it, you don't have to sign it again, but we're going to pass them around anyway, just to make sure we do get everybody. Okay.
So we'll leave this up for 1 minute and then really get started in 1 minute, since we have so few people back from the break. Okay, now that we've done the note well,
We might have another 6 minutes, according to the agenda. What time is this supposed to start?
20.
No, 13:30.
So unfortunately, our sound problems are back.
Yes.
Do we still have the sound person in the room? Okay. Well, that's cute. I managed to lock the screen.
And you don't know your password.
Nope.
Okay. Okay, so can everyone hear me? Is this on?
Go close.
close?
Well, this is quite close, but it's.
Maybe it's off.
Is that better? No. Hello?
Hello? Hello?
Shall I just try and talk loudly?
We have enough people on Jabber that we can.
Okay.
Can you hear?
Oh,
We're back.
right.
We're back.
Okay. So I'm going to give an update on the NMDA Datastore architecture draft. That's been through last call. We effectively resolved most of the comments. There's a couple of outstanding issues. I am going to go over the major changes we've made, just so people know what they are. Hopefully these have all been discussed on the list and tracked anyway. So yes, working group last call summary, a summary of the changes, and then I want to spend most of the time on these things at the end if possible, and give some time back if necessary. So we had 18 issues raised. They've all been tracked on GitHub, and that's the URL to where they are. 16 of those issues are effectively regarded as being closed, so we've sent the final text, proposed text, back to the ALIS, and in some cases people have agreed to it, in other cases just silence. I think that's fairly normal, but we'll ask people to check the latest version of the draft. There's sort of two issues still being tracked as open. One of them is moving to the RFC2119 language, and that's open just so the people who are requesting that, once they've read the latest version of the draft and checked that they're happy with that. And then the other issue is regarding actions and RPCs. Again, that's been discussed on the ALIS. There's a proposed solution here, which is the same one that's been around, but we'll cover that as well. So in terms of the summary of the changes, looking back on the differences, there's 6 major changes that I can track. A new objective section has been added. This is just really like an introduction text, so feel free to read that and have a look. I'm not going to cover it anymore. We've updated the document to use RFC 2119 language to our best efforts. So again, please can that be reviewed so people are happy with it, but otherwise I won't cover that any further. And then the next 4 I'll go into more detail on. One is about origin metadata. So we're restricting that to the config true subset of operational. One is we've now defined configuration transformations. So and that's to sort of get around the issues we had regarding inactive config and templating. We've defined Datastore schema. I'll cover that in a bit more detail, and clarify the relationships between the data stores in a bit more detail as well. And then finally, there's this actions and RPCs issue that is sort of slightly still open. So origin metadata, previously that applied in the previous version of the draft of last IETF to all the contents of operational. Now it only applies to the config true subset of operational. The reason we did that, there's 3 reasons. One is it's slightly hard to define where the source of the origin comes from for the config false data. Often this is system or looks like system, so it didn't make much sense. We thought it'd be quite hard to implement, difficult for implementations to actually track this and provide this. They wouldn't want it. And the last one that probably was the winner for us was that we have quite a simple encoding that we want to use for the origin metadata, which is sort of hierarchical, that if you don't specify the origin for a given node, it inherits from its parent, so it picks up the same value. So in the mainline case, that if your configuration has come from your intended config, you could mark the top node in the tree as intended, and that would recurse down. And hence you then only have to put the extra annotations into the tree where it's not from the intended config, where it's come from some other place. So the aim there is that this encoding is reasonably lightweight. Similarly, if you can't support origin metadata, again, you can mark the top level node as being origin, I think it's unknown or not, I can't remember what it is. It might be unknown, and effectively that recurse all the way down the tree. So again, that's quite simple to do. Configuration transformations. So this is the new text that's wrapped on this slide for some reason, and effectively it's defined as the addition, modification, or removal of configuration between the running and intended data stores. Examples of this are inactive configuration and templates expansion. So the aim here was to twofold. One is to take out things like templating and inactive from the normative text from the document. We didn't want to actually be defining either of those. We just wanted to use them as examples. So by making this change, they now effectively just become examples of what config transformations might be. Intended is now defined. We've tweaked that to be defined as being after these config transformations. It always was before. That's now become more explicit. And we've said also that running allows you to have configuration in there that doesn't yet have these transformations applied to it. So you might still have to process those. Right, so I'm just going to pull up the data stores picture to remind people of what it looks like as I talk about what the meaning of these data stores are. So you've got running, intended, and operational. There's one change to this diagram is that when we discussed this with the I2S folks at the last IETF, it turned out that the dynamic data stores only needed to be configuration. So again, those are now classified as dynamic configuration data stores at the moment. I don't think this architecture necessarily constrains that, but that's the use case that we have today. So data stores, schemas, and conformance. Some of the discussion points that came up was to get more clarity on the exact definitions of these data stores. So we've tried to do that. And so we've pulled in a definition of what a data store schema is. So this has come about that we're using the term schema, and it's not actually defined in RFC 7950 what a schema is. So our way around it in this document was to define data store schema as the combined set of schema nodes for all the modules supported by a particular data store. So we use this and refer to it in Yang library, and it's effectively what common sense makes you think it is. So one sort of interesting point here is that, and it's come up again in Lada's document, I think, on schema mount, is that some of these terms aren't really defined in a brilliant way. And it would be quite nice potentially to define these terms like schema, like data store schemas defined here. And this document might be a possible place to put that in, put those definitions in, as long as we could actually achieve that quite quickly and not delay this document. So that's a question, I think, to the working group, is whether we should try and resolve that. Should we try and add those definitions in, define what a schema is, define what data store schema is. I can't remember what other ones there were. Data tree might have been another one. There's a few of these terms that we also to understand, I think, what they are, but we don't actually define them anywhere. Anyone has any opinions on this? No? Oh, maybe.
Excuse me, John Heasley, NTT. I really would like to see all those terms defined.
Speak closer to the microphone, please.
Sorry. I would like to see all those terms defined in the document. There shouldn't be any kind of ambiguity, in my opinion.
Okay, so there's not ambiguity in this document at the moment. It's more actually the schema mount one that has the ambiguity. So the idea is we put those references in here because we can't put them into 7950 as this has been the next best place rather than defining them in the schema mount document.
I would say as long as you can actually determine that there's that link between the two documents to find that definition, that would be sufficient. But to leave them undefined, I think, is a bad course.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of this conformance, it's worth pointing out that there's two rules to the NMDA conformance. Again, this came out through discussions. One is that all conventional data stores must have the same data store schema. So that says that startup, running, candidate and intended all have the same schema. You can't change them. You can't have different features in them. You can't have different deviations in them. And that allows configuration to move between those data stores in an easy way. It does also limit the scope of what those configuration transformations can do and what they may be, because you know that whatever modifications they are making is still retained within the same schema when it gets to intended. And then we allow operational to be the superset of all the sort of configuration data stores, so all the schema of the configuration data stores, but we allowed nodes to be removed by deviation, and modules to be removed from that list. So the aim here is to effectively try and be realistic as to what what implementations might be able to do, and be realistic that there's going to be some time in terms of migration, that there'll be times that not all implementations will be able to implement all of this operational state straight away. So we're expecting deviations to occur for an interim period on this operational state data store. Updated data store definitions on running. So we said that that may include configuration that requires further transformations before it can be applied, but it's always defined as being valid. So we're not changing RFC 7950. We're saying that running is always valid, but if you consider that in the case of these configuration transformations, you'd probably effectively say that you have to expand them as part of that validation. So there's a slight sort of cheat here. And we're saying that whenever running is updated, you automatically update intended at the same time. That happens like it's the same step, and intended is always validated at the same point. However, so intended happens after all the configuration transformations. Intended is always valid as well, but it may change independently of running. So if you had a configuration transformation that was part of the system, for example, and you upgraded the software, you could find that running stayed the same, but intended changes because one of those configuration transformations changed. So we don't have many cases for this, but we wanted to keep that as an open possibility. And then the final one that we did in terms of the sort of review comments was to try and more closely relate or tie the contents of intended to the config true part of operational, to say that you can actually provide a diff-like operation between the two, because the two relate to each other. Finally, definition of operational. So we now say, as I said before, that the schema is a superset of all the configuration data store schemas, except the deviations that allow you to delete nodes, and you may choose not to implement modules in operational. We've defined the term in use. And in particular, this is to try and say that you don't have to return data that's not in use. And hence it's to avoid the case that you have to return lots of state that's not relevant. So if you haven't configured a routing protocol, then you don't have to return any state for it. You might choose to return the flag that says the routing protocol is not enabled, but the rest of the state that isn't in effect isn't returned. You're not having to return lots of noise. We say that semantic constraints may be violated, and that's the same as what it was before, except that we've now included list keys. We came up with an example of where list keys may become violated, and hence we say that's required. But we're still keeping that the constraint that syntactic constraints must not be violated. You have to be able to encode the data you're returning. So on to the issue that's outstanding is on actions and RPCs. There's been quite a lot of discussion on this between the authors and on the alias. So this is coming up from Martin's email that summarized this issue. The problem is which data store is used to evaluate three choices. One is action ancestor nodes. The second one is action input output parameter, leaf ref, instance ref, must and when statements. And the third one is similarly for RPCs. The question is, effectively, when you get these actions or RPCs, where do you evaluate the parameters to those operations? And this is not related to what effect those actions or RPCs are doing. They can have whatever effect they like. So even if you say that these actions and RPCs are limited to operational, you could still have an action RPC that says I want to reboot the server, or I want to modify a different data store. So this isn't about what effects they have, it's only about where you evaluate the parameters for them. So on the email, there were 4 solutions that were proposed. I think in terms of the discussion that's happened on that, the preferred solution was number 1 on that email thread, which is effectively, for the moment, always used for this draft NMDA to define that you always use operational for, it says 1 and 2, it should be 1, 2, and 3. So all 3 of these are always evaluated in the context of operational. So that's what we want to define now. But in future, we could extend the protocols and possibly the Yang language as well to allow these to be evaluated in other target data stores if that was required. So in the case of actions and RPCs, it might be the case that you would add a data store parameter to those RPC operations to allow you to specify a different data store. If we were to do that, I think you probably need a Yang statement to also denote which data stores you can actually allow that action or RPC statement to apply to as well. So, but
Rob, it's Lou. Isn't there also an option of just making that? Isn't that it? Sorry. Isn't there also an option just to make that part of the RPC definition?
which bit?
Which data store it operates on. So if the current definition is always operational, perhaps you, let's say, want to operate on a different data store. You could end up having one that says config.
So
always operate on config, and
so you can still do that now. That's allowed because it's.
Sorry.
That's right. So you're allowed to do that now because this isn't about where that RPC
Exactly.
operates. It's only about where you evaluate the arguments.
right.
And so the new edit data RPC acts on whichever data store you specify, it acts on, but it has no parameters that you actually have to evaluate. So it doesn't matter where you evaluate it. And it's saying you evaluate against operational, that's fine.
And you're okay with all those implications.
At the moment, yes, because I don't think there's many examples of RPCs or action statements that this actually matters for.
Okay.
There's one case that we thought that might be useful, but I don't think it's worth delaying this document now to do that. I think that work is not important enough to delay this. I think you can do that as a subsequent update.
It's not clear that you need an update, right?
Correct.
So it'd just be good to make sure that that's adequately covered, and I certainly will read that as Shepard to make sure I think it's adequately covered.
Well, I think what the document doesn't say now that'd be useful is this last point here that effectively
Exactly.
is that
Yeah.
this we expect that this could get updated in future. So implementations.
Oh, I thought you were going to say something else. I thought you were going to say that it doesn't cover this alternate use and the evaluation in the context of operational, while the operation can be defined as long as that's in there. I think we're covered.
Okay, I don't think that's in there now. I think that could be clearer.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Clarification question.
Of course.
The RIB I2S dynamic data store has RPCs in it. Because it's in the ephemeral data store, does it mean it's going to be workable under this solution?
Probably. So the issue is not about where the RPC is acting. The issue is about any parameters.
That's right.
So if you've got parameters that have to be evaluated against a different data store, then that would require future work. That would require new work. But if the parameter was, so an example would be if you had a leaf ref to a given node, if you had an action RPC that says, I want to check the existence of this node in the dynamic data store, then you can't do that. You can only check the existence of that in the operational data store at the moment with this draft.
So if the RPC, let's go one layer down on that. So the RPC adds a route, the route adds a next hop, the next hop then does a leaf ref into a different data store. But the top RPC only does the next hop.
So you can add the data wherever you like. That's not a problem. That's its side effects. The side effects could be anywhere. It's only the input parameters.
Okay.
Just looking at those, if they had a leaf ref, so if you had an action statement that said I operate on this node, then that node would have to exist in the operational state data store.
So just the top level load if it's a route with a next hop. But if it's a route with a next hop and a interface, then we're in problems because the interface is in the configuration data store.
If it's checking that as a parameter, so if part of the RPC or action statement's input parameters have a leaf ref or instance ref, then you'd have an issue.
Yes.
So
we should look at that
carefully.
afterwards. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
We have something from Martin. Which I2RS drafts has those RPCs, Sue? Okay, so Sue says it's the RIB draft. Martin.
So
And Sue says hi to Jeff, by the way.
So I think that otherwise all the issues on this draft have been resolved other than that last one. So effectively, I think that our aim is to complete the working group last call as soon as possible. I think it's potentially worth checking this RIB case.
So Tim Carey, Nokia, I just
Yep.
wanted to be sure of something because as I was thinking, as you were speaking, I was thinking through that problem that you were talking about.
Can you lean in a little, please?
Yes. So if you have an action or an RPC, right, that it has an argument that you would want to target a module, a plugin that doesn't exist. It's not going to be in the operational piece, but you expected it to be in the intended, or take advantage of the intended or one of the config data stores. Are you saying that that's not possible?
If it was an action statement and it's under a particular node, then that node has to exist in operational for that action
Right.
statement.
But if I have a pluggable element, that's not going to exist in operational, right? Because it doesn't exist.
Correct. Then you would not be able to execute that action.
Okay.
Or it goes down to this bottom step here. You say, well, we need to specify this work. We need to define.
We need
the
to be able
action
to specify or designate the data store, right?
Yeah, you do an action 2. Is the proposal is you define a new action that has a data store as a parameter, and that data store would dictate where you process the argument. So we know how to do it. We're just not sure we need to do it.
We just got to
now.
be careful when we do these, right? You know, where you're saying if
Yeah.
it disappears in the operational, you're going to have to put it into the actual action then, right?
Yeah.
Like that. Hello, get close. Christian Hops, ET. Earlier, there was a little confusion, I think, when Lou said something about the RPC on acting on something. So I went back and checked my math and everything. I'm not sure if we're really precise in the draft right now, but we could use function terminology, right? In which case, an RPC on would be the input, right?
Okay.
That's the domain.
Yeah.
So when you say the RPC is on, it would actually be the inputs.
It's only the inputs that matter.
Right. So I mean, but it is confusing because when you hear the RPC on acting on,
Yes.
you know, then
Yes.
you were thinking he meant,
yeah,
you know, was it acting on config or this or that, and it could be acting on anything, but no, in fact, it's acting on the operational.
Yeah.
Right, because that's the input to the RPC.
Yeah.
I don't know, but
okay.
All right. Comment from Jabber. Martin says these RPCs, I think referring back to Sue's, seem to work today since they use strings, not leaf refs. And Martin, are you talking about in general or the ones in the draft? I think you're talking about the ones in the draft.
Must be.
So I just checked
and
the
he
draft.
confirms it's in the draft.
Okay, so I just checked the draft. We're actually not looking at the interface. We've done something intelligent, maybe for once, and it's just an ID. So I think we're all, we took away the interface reference. So I think we're just in the data store that we're a part of. So that'll be good. So tell Martin to look in the RPC section. There's the next top ID. That's what he wants to look at.
Okay, I think you actually just told him.
So does that mean effectively we're happy with this conclusion, in which case I think that we can make the updates to the draft to cover this, which should be fairly minor, and then we post it out to the working group just to check?
Yeah, I think you can make the changes unless you have some question on the language. If you have question on the language, send the language to the list and let's close on it.
Yeah.
Once we have the next version, the updated version that captures this change, I'd like to, I'll do a read through as Shepherd, but expecting, I don't think I'll find anything. We'll then do another last call.
Okay.
Because we've had a bunch of changes that were a result of the last call. I think we've hit the threshold for doing another one, and then we'll publish it.
Okay.
Or submit, excuse me, we'll submit to the ISG a publication request. They get to decide when it's actually published.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
I just want to request people to try to get on the Etherpad and help us take notes.
Hi, I'm presenting a draft that Martin and I have been working on. Martin is remote, so I'm sure he'll chime in if I say anything he doesn't quite agree with, which hopefully won't occur. So we're talking about the tree diagrams document. And as we've talked about in the last couple of meetings, we have our annotations for trees show up, the description of that show up in a bunch of different documents, different RFCs, and they're not always aligned. And the trees are an important part of our documentation process to help make these long modules more accessible. And it's important to keep in mind that even though we have tools that produce our trees, the product of trees and the target of trees are us, people reading the documents, and more importantly, the next folks who are going to read the documents and implement them. But it is a documentation tool. It's not a tool that gets that generates code or generates structure that's going to be executed by code. What we've done since the last meeting is we've tried very hard to close off all the issues so that we might be ready for last call. And we thought we had done so until we had a little discussion on the list. We'll talk about that in a moment. The other things that we've done is we've completed all the open sections. We clarified some of the open issues as well as some of the imprecision that was in the previous version, notably related to mount points and parent references. And we also made some changes from the previous version in terms of how we do annotations. And most of the changes that were potentially controversial have been discussed on the list. So the current representation is what you see on the right-hand side. And if you're tracking it carefully, you're familiar with the discussion. If you're not, the representation should look pretty familiar. The biggest change is related to how we're dealing with mounted modules and parent reference modules. One of the things we did is, and this was as a result of looking at some documents, some modules that are being produced in other working groups, we gave some guidance on long trees. And that ended up opening to a general discussion on list of where guidance belongs. We have a document that is describing a format. That was its primary purpose, but then we ended up going on to giving guidelines. But keep in mind, we're talking about guidelines to authors for documents, not for modules. It's very important to remember that we're talking about this is purely a documentation focused effort, not anything that ends up in code or on the wire. So we now have some guidelines in this draft. We also have 6087 BIS, which is guidelines to authors. And it does a couple of things, which is sort of interesting. One of them has a section 251 that points to this document. Then it has another section 3.4 with very minimal guidelines on what to do about trees. And so we have our document that I'm discussing that has a format definition and some guidelines. Then we have 6087 BIS that has a whole bunch of guidelines to authors, plus a little bit on trees, but still depends on this one. And it seems like this isn't the optimal arrangement, and that's really been the discussion on the list. So one option that we have is we remove any guidelines from this document, put it into 6087 BIS. While that may be nice, it means that we have to reopen 6087 BIS, which we really would like to close and push out. It also goes to the approach of whether or not we want to bundle everything into big documents or distribute them into focus documents that cover a topic completely. So one option, strip out guidelines, move it into 6087 BIS. Another guideline, I think this has been another proposal that I think was circulated on list, or maybe it was just privately, is let's just get rid of this whole guidelines thing. This is just turning into a never-ending process, and since it doesn't end up on the wire, who cares? Let's just put it in a wiki, and then we can update it on the fly as it goes. It's an interesting idea, but one of the issues with that is other people who aren't here or aren't sort of in the know, the way they know about what we do here is RFCs we publish. So how will someone who's not in the middle of the IETF use our work and know that they're supposed to follow a guideline. They won't. So the last option is let's put all the guidelines into into one document, in the same document that we are defining the trees. Make a change to 6887 BIS, but one that's very minor that says just for trees, go read our draft. So those are sort of the three options. I'll state a personal preference. I'm not going to speak for Martin. My personal preference is I think we should be doing three. It sort of seems like the obvious thing to me, quite honestly, but there are lots of different perspectives. And with that, questions?
So Rob Wilson, Cisco. I actually quite like, if there's guidelines to go in any document, I put them in 6087 bits.
You know what? I can't hear you. I'm sorry.
If there's, okay. Is that better? Just. If there's any guidelines that need to go in a document, I'd put them in 6087 BIS. But actually, personally, I think a wiki is a better place for this sort of stuff because it's constantly churning, it's constantly changing, and I think the guidelines will continue to be revised. And then in terms of your question as to how do non-IETFers learn about it, you have an informational RFC that points you to the current guidelines on a wiki.
Okay, so what you would say is take the guidelines out of this document, and in our document, the tree document, point to the wiki.
All guidelines, 6087 BIS.
Microphone.
Or put the 6087 BIS draft into GitHub and point to that or something, and then that can just be updated. I mean, it wouldn't be an RFC, and then every now and again you stamp it, rubber stamp it through the process, and say, okay, now it's the current RFC.
Tim Carey, Nokia. So, in other places we're doing the same thing, right? And so we use the wikis for, guidelines type of things because you can rev the stuff a little bit faster. And so, I would recommend same thing that what Rob is saying, move all your guidelines over into a better place that you can more quickly maintain and be more responsive to the work, right? As things change and get added. I keep hearing through here was says, well, geez, we got to biz the 60, the guidelines. That stuff's just going to change as you guys will figure out how to work things that don't deal with the actual modules.
Mahesh Chetanandani. My personal preference, actually, I would agree with you, Lou, and I would personally think that we should go with number 3. But whatever we choose, I think we need to decide soon because we have authors that we have told that need to reference this document, whatever form it takes, as a reference rather than trying to cut and paste, which is the original problem we began with. So whatever we decide, we better have a clear guideline because we have people waiting on their documents, wanting to publish, but since this document is not making progress, their document is held up. Okay. And a related question, would this, if it becomes an RFC, would this be a normative or an informative reference that other people have to make?
So I'm going to state my personal opinion. I think this is an informative. Why? Because it doesn't go on the wire, and it's not a best common practice for protocol. So my personal opinion is it's an informational document. I would, of course, defer to my co-chair and the AD and the ISG if they want to change that, and whatever they come up with is fine with me. But I think it's informational because it's not a protocol bit on the wire.
Lou, what is the current intended status on the document?
I don't remember.
Balázs Lengyel Eriksson. I am happy with any solution, although I prefer probably 3. What I want to avoid is a wiki that is changing day by day, and I have to constantly keep checking what is the current status.
Yeah, I'm actually involved in like an open source effort where the standard, the coding standard keeps changing, and I'm now going crazy, and I'm spending more time dealing with coding standard updates than I am doing the code, and that. It's really annoying.
I can't distribute the daily changes to the 300 workers I am responsible for updating about Yang.
So, Benoit. So, on the informational, yes, informational, because 6087 is informational, right? So, same category. In terms of options, I have a preference for 1 as an contributor.
I keep telling you it's an industry-wide problem. We need to have a single point where we provide guidelines. We heard that multiple times on the guidelines. How do I create young models, etc. A single place. And yes, it evolves. The guidelines in 2 years from now will be different. Maybe we'll have some ver, right? So preference for one.
Rob Wilton again. So one comment about like IEEE, my understanding is that when they were looking at guidelines, they're looking at RFC 6087 and not 6087 BIS because that one hasn't actually been published yet. So they're looking at the older state potentially rather than the sort of current draft that hasn't yet been published because that's what they want to reference and want to look at. So again, the same issue about taking a long time to update the guidelines is causing a problem.
Actually, I support number 2, and I agree with Rob that it should be sufficient. And to Balázs' comment, I think it's not really rules about life and death, so it's not necessary to check these rules every day. I think that just if a young doctor, for example, indicates that some rules are not followed, then it might be possible to change it. But I think a wiki would be a good solution in this case.
I have a couple. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
So yeah, I personally really don't like the notion of big, massive documents that try to do everything at once. I mean, I think that's just a very slow way of working. That's a personal statement. As co-author, excuse me, as well as someone who has something to do with process in here, I just want an answer, and so that we can push this thing out. So I hope we can reach consensus on that. Well, and I looked at my chair.
I'm going to ask for okay.
So
A couple comments from.
Let me just throw out there. Nobody's mentioned this option yet. The option is we publish a document with a pointer to a wiki that has ongoing work and in revision, right? So you sort of can bridge the gap where you have a constant standard document you can point people at, like IEEE, and yet you can also track new work quickly because it develops, instead of developing it in drafts or whatever, you always have it on a wiki, and that wiki is pointed to by the published RFC for the work beyond the.
Yeah, I think that was the modification that someone else earlier said was take 2 and add a reference to the wiki in the guidelines documents.
Okay, this is Kent channeling Jabber. Martin says that he favors option number 3. He says wikis have a tendency to not be alive after some time. Just look at the various Yang wikis we have. And Jeff Huss says wikis also are problematic for anything that is intended to be canonical. Access control to them would to such an item would be very important. Okay, so with that, I would.
Yeah, how do you want to resolve? How do we go forward as authors?
So I would like to ask the room to raise their hands for the various options. I'm going to read them out. 1, 2, 3. Please raise your hands for if you support number 1. Raise your hand now.
Wait, just to be clear, 2 is modified to that we point to the wiki in the tree document.
Okay.
And 6087 BIS.
Yes, with that. Okay, so I'll add that. So if you support putting all the guidelines into 6087 BIS and removing them from this draft, please raise your hand.
Microphone, please.
I mean, there are, Mehmet Ersu, I mean, there are other options possible. So asking for these options is probably not optimal.
So maybe we'll add a number. How about adding a number 4?
I mean,
let me 4 be other, something else?
Let me state first my opinion and the option I think should be interesting. I mean, I support option 2, but because I think having everything in one document is practically very difficult to achieve because we cannot update one document again and again, where another document like this one here would be interesting to publish as soon as possible. And the wiki would be actually listing references to RFCs which have been defined as a guideline. It can be first 60 78 BIS, and then other documents like this one here. And the wiki is not to write down the rules or suggestions. The wiki is actually only a collection of references to RFCs.
Okay, there's a few more comments from Jabber. Jürgen says, who maintains the wiki? I'm not sure if we have to answer that right now, but something to consider. Okay. Jeff Huss says, additional option is some sort of IANA maintenance. Moves faster than a full RFC. And Martin says, links to the RFCs also have problems. Try to follow the link to security considerations in 6087. Hint, it's a 404. Okay. Sorry, we have a couple more at the microphone, but we do need to do a poll, so can you make it quick?
Rolf, I try to. So is there a need to actually progress a document to RFC? So if you have a document and you want to change it, just don't make an RFC, and you have change control. The authors have change control over it, and process applies. So you just keep it a draft, and then you can alter it.
So your option number 4 or 5, depending on how we're counting, is just keep something in draft forever. I think that would be for the guidelines part, not for the base definition. So I think we have 1, 2, 3, 4, which is, and 4 is other, is that right?
Other, yeah.
So we poll?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, 4 will be other in case you don't like any of the current options. So again, if you prefer option, sorry, do we have a comment at the mic? Okay, if you prefer option 1, can you please raise your hand? And if you're on Jabber,
Actually,
just type.
yes, I've got a comment. This is almost my last meeting, and I want to remind people of what we do in the IETF in terms of tradition. We hum. We don't vote at the IETF.
Well, some of us don't have great ears. And if we hum, it means that I might hear a few people in the front. I'm not going to hear people in the back. So we're not required to hum, and it doesn't work for my ears, full stop.
Yeah, me neither.
I can't handle the hums. I will not be able to judge the results as a chair if we hum. I'm sorry. My ears don't work that way. It's not a required part of our process. We should take this outside the room. We should take it outside the room. That's why we always say a reasonable number, a good number. You'll never hear us give you the count.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We're not actually going to count.
We don't record a count. We record a good number. A few people.
Okay, try number 3. If you prefer option 1, please raise your hand.
So a few people.
If you prefer option number 2, please raise your hand. It's
a little bit more.
Or a good number. If you prefer option number 3, please raise your hand. About the same as option number 2. And and there's also 2 more hands on Jabber going up for number 3. And then if you prefer option number 4, which was other, so none of the ones we spoke of, a few. Okay, I think we
So
have.
that was the least.
That was the least, right? So we'll just record those numbers. Thank you,
So
Lou.
I guess I'll look to the chair to figure out how we move forward between options 2 and 3. Thank you very much for the input. We had one last open issue. I believe the plan is just to go with what Martin had suggested on email, and I believe that's the last thing is use allow for the uses to be shown. And if I have that wrong, we'll correct it on the list. So the biggest thing is, of course, resolve the open issues, which we now know is between 2 and 3. Publish a new version, move to last call. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Joe? And we are running behind, so anything you can do to speed up would be great.
Okay, so last time we met, this was in Prague, and we presented our proposal for the Yang catalog, essentially the thing that backs up yangcatalog.org. You may recall that we are not necessarily looking for standardization or ratification of this module. What we are doing is sharing with you the work that has gone on to create a metadata repository for Yang modules. Some of the things I'm going to talk about today, Benoit raised in terms of semantic version. These things have been driven by use cases that we've received by talking specifically with operators. So one of the things we wanted to do is expand the use cases for the catalog. As Benoit has said, it's about the tool, it's about the Yang modules, it's about the tooling, and it's about the metadata. And that's the metadata is what this module defines, and it's directly in support of the tooling, which is directly in support of the use cases that the operators have come by. So what's new in this in this particular revision? We've added the semantic version and the derived semantic version, of which we heard about a little bit earlier today. We added the ability to track a module, a submodule, and to whom it belongs. And we've added the ability to track the tree type, the NMDA tree type. In addition, we've expanded the catalog's reach into Data Tracker, and some of you may have seen the Data Tracker links that have the Yang catalog links that have recently appeared in Data Tracker. And we've been able to link module exploration, so dynamic ways of interacting with modules into the tooling in the Yang catalog. For those of you who can't wait for the movie, here is the Yang tree structure for both the module and the vendor subtrees. Just guidelines. The new use cases that we've come up with, and we think the first one is critical. Every operator we've talked to, as Benoit says, they are composing service modules. They need to understand that given a module or given a release of code for a specific vendor, tell me very easily, very quickly, what modules are backwards incompatible, meaning which ones have backward incompatible changes. And then we've added additional tooling, and I'll show you that in a minute, to show you what those specific changes are, both from a tree type as well as the textual. So those are the first two use cases. Then we want to say we wanted to provide a comprehensive metadata store to drive all the tooling. So as part of the latest version of the Yang catalog, all of the tools on there directly use this module, which creates or stores all of this metadata. And then one of the things that Benoit has been doing in his trek around different SDOs is to be able to say, here are your modules, and here's how they relate to NMDA compatibility or compliance. You've seen this slide. I won't spend much time on it. We are algorithmically or heuristically determining this derived semantic version that will help, at least from a syntactic standpoint, show users or consumers of Yang modules where those modules are different. So at a quick glance, you can see that revision N+1 of a given module is either backward compatible or not to revision N. So let's take an example. This is the IETF interfaces. From this, we provide a link in our API, in our in the Yang catalog API, that will allow one to look at the tree side-by-side tree diffs, as well as the side-by-side textual diffs, if there is a semantic version, major semantic version difference. In this case, revision 1.0.0 of the Yang interfaces module, sorry, IETF interfaces module differs in this way from version 2.0.0. So you immediately know there's a backward incompatible change by the major version numbers, and you can visualize what those differences are. The other thing that we're doing is, again, being able to track the full metadata store in the Yang catalog. We're directly feeding this into tools, and we have an API to access it. So the colorful Skittles rainbow you see up there of the impact analysis is directly fed from the metadata we're collecting. That metadata is available via APIs. So it's linked off of the catalog page. You can consume those APIs for your own tooling. And again, it's about that tooling and it's about that metadata that help make these Yang modules consumable. As I mentioned, we're also tracking NMDA compliance. So given a module or a set of modules, you can, really doesn't like me, you can understand whether or not this is a split tree or an NMDA compatible tree or something else like, for example, open config style. I mentioned that the links from Yang catalog are now being put into Data Tracker so that it's easier for maybe not within NetMod or NetConf or in the ops area. It's easier for model developers to understand what tools are available and help them write better Yang modules that take advantage of the set of tooling that we're coming up with by consensus in this area and in these working groups. And finally, we are integrating newer tools into the Yang catalog that will allow users of modules as well as the authors of modules better make use of that. Learn from the best practices in terms of the data that are the constructs that are going into modules, and be able to say, given a module, how can I consume it? How can I create a script and test it against my devices? Or how can I write or take a script and test it against some automated test suite? So as part of the hackathon this time around, we had one of the contributors building an automated test harness based on confd, based on netconfd, that we could feed scripts from our Yang development kit integration into, to be able to test, for example, the examples in Yang modules, that they are consistent with the Yang module definitions. Our next steps, primarily, first and foremost, we want to make sure that all vendors and all SDOs are contributing their modules in a publicly consumable fashion, such as GitHub, and that they publish their metadata to us. We have links off of the contribute page on how they can do that. And we are looking at potential new use cases. For example, how can we do things like bundling that Andy mentioned last time and has come up as part of the discussion around version? How can we track module expiration? Drafts expire, but we don't have any semantic in modules to understand when those modules may expire. And also, we want to be able to look at the Yang tree on a per module basis and advertise that via metadata and then via the API. Questions?
And if we can be quick, just because we're tight on time.
I think it would be useful to be able to specify this metadata in the Yang module itself. So perhaps it would be nice to have an extension so that authors of new modules can put the metadata directly there, so that it can be used with other tools and it will be clear. So maybe sometimes your automatic tools cannot determine everything perfectly. So this would be, I think, useful and a nice application for a Yang extension.
That's a good point. So we've defined metadata in both extractable, which we can pull from the module, and non-extractable. Having some of these as more extractable things would be very useful, yes.
Not only a good point, but it's the topic of the next presentation, which if Chris can come up, we'll just get right into it.
Thank you very much.
Also, thank you, Joe. Also, at the end of this presentation, we're going to poll for interest if the working group would like to adopt this document. So keep that in mind as you're watching or listening to this presentation.
Wow, thanks for that lead-in. So I'm going to talk about module tags, which is the ability to add metadata to modules. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, I'm in control, aren't I? So we've had 2 revisions since it was last presented in IETF 98. Oh, I have something right in front of me. And the changes during those 2 revisions were to remove a per module tag list. So originally we had designed it so that the tags, we sort of had the tags in multiple places. We had them in an augment in the Yang library, we had them in a global list, and we also had them per module list. The problem with the per module list is it would only go in there if the author included it, and I liked it. Everyone else was like, we don't really need it, and so they convinced me to pull it out. The reason I liked it was because I thought you could do cool XPath stuff if the tags were right with the module. But and we also originally had add and delete RPCs, and that was just ill-conceived, I think, because we can just use edit config, and Martin or Jürgen pointed out that we were doing an end run there. So we removed the add and delete. We do still have an RPC that is config, that does operate on config. That's reset. So here's what it looks like now. Well, one of the modules. We have a module tags list where each entry is a module identified as it is in the Yang library with name and revision, and then a list of tags. The RPC reset tags, the reason that's there is because we allow the end user to delete tags. If you recall, the tags can be added in 3 places: by the module author, by the vendor, the implementer, and then finally by the user. And then the user is, in this case, the ultimate arbiter of the truth. So the user can, for example, say, you might have tagged that as supporting this feature, but I found out you're buggy, and so I'm going to remove that tag because I don't think that you support that feature. This is an example of what it looks like in XML. And the other module we have currently is an augment on the Yang library, because it's sort of nice to have the tag list there alongside the module. This sort of annoyed me that I couldn't just put this here, period. And the reason we can't is because the Yang library is very like read-only. There's all kinds of text floating around saying, you know, I think that they're being discussed about when the client can read the Yang library and count on it not changing until certain things happen. And anyway, that's why we can't really have it there. I mean, we even thought about keeping the read-only list there and then using the RPC end run scheme so we could modify it. But anyway, that would have been messy. So the open issues right now are, should we have, this was raised by Rob Wilton. He raised this to me, just this IETF, about should we separate the tag config from the tag list? Right now they sort of are the same, right? So you would imagine the config being there. If there was predefined tags, they would already be there in the list. And that you could then go in and write a new list that removed them. That's how you would delete tags. And he pointed out that they're trying to move away from that with NMDA to have it empty, right? If you didn't put the config there, then the config is empty. In which case, the way that would look is that you would have a config area, and then your operational, you would have operational area where the tags that were predefined would be, and your config would then add or delete on that list. This would get rid of the need for the reset RPC. I kind of like when they're mapped together because it's just clean looking in my head, but I do see this. So this is something I think we should talk about on the list. Also, I think Lou might have mentioned that maybe we should just remove the Yang library augment too. I mean, why have 2 lists? We have the case there is, again, I think there's a case maybe for XPath, because you can do nicer XPath things for selecting modules when they're right, the data is right next to each other, as opposed to going down to the root and back up into a list. So, and then we do have a list of initial standard tags. So I think we should, get some maybe a little bit more action of people looking at that, to see, looking it over and seeing if we've got what people think is a good base set. So far we've had mostly almost entirely positive feedback on this. I think I'd like to ask for working group adoption. And we'll continue to work on the open issues. But
okay, any comments?
So Rob Wilton, Cisco. So yes, I mean, I like this work. I think it's useful. Obviously, if it's adopted, I prefer the solution in terms of the configuration that's been discussed. I think that's for discussion there. But generally, yes, I'm positive on this. So.
Jabber from Jabber. Martin says support, and then, but it would be good with a solution without the reset RPC.
So he likes Rob's.
I mean, but this is a good discussion for once it's in the working group.
Okay, so as promised, we wanted to poll the room for interest in this draft. So first interest, and then we'll ask for adoption. Okay, so if you are interested in this work, we think it's a problem that needs to be solved, please raise your hand. I'm going to say a few. Okay. All right. And likewise, if you've, well, hold on, there's a few. Okay. If you would like to see this draft adopted, please raise your hand. The same number, I think. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, just a few. Can you write? Okay. Hi, Kent Watson, Juniper Networks, presenting Yang data extensions. Okay. The problem is Yang extension statement, Yang data in the module IETF RESTconf, which is in RFC 8040, can be used to define a data structure that is not intended to be part of a data store. The original use case was for RESTconf resources and errors, but since then it's been used to define file formats and also protocol messages. However, this solution has, well, actually 3 limitations, not just a couple. The structure cannot be augmented, which you'll see the reason for wanting to do so in an upcoming slide. The structure must define exactly one container, which is an issue that the zero-touch draft is having a concern with. And also it creates a dependency to RFC 8040, the RESTconf draft, which is kind of strange. You know, for instance, the zero-touch draft needing to have a normative reference to the RESTconf draft. Just it's unnecessary for this purpose. The solution is to have a separate document that defines 2 new extension statements, the first being Yang data, which is, yes, it's the same string, but it'll be a different prefix, a different namespace, so it's not actually, we're not actually removing it from the RESTconf draft there, which would be intended to replace IETF RESTconf Yang data. So, I mean, there'd be no need to update 8040 immediately. It's that definition could stay there, you know, indefinitely, but if ever there were an update to 8040, it could at that time potentially be moved over to use this other statement. The semantics would be the same, but it would remove the limitations that the top-level node must be a single container. And the other top-level extension statement would be augment Yang data, which could be used to augment a data structure defined with Yang data. So there's some open issues. First, should we also define a new statement like uses Yang data that can be used just like normal uses in all places where uses can be used? The drawback is that we get 2 ways of defining reusable structures, grouping and Yang data. Any comments on this?
I don't really understand why you need this augment Yang data, why you cannot augment it as a normal data.
I think this came from the Anima working group with the voucher draft, and then separately there's a Brewski draft. And the Brewski draft, so the voucher draft uses Yang data to define a data structure for the voucher. The Brewski draft basically wants to, it is a voucher, but it adds in some additional fields. And so what they wanted to do was to use the voucher data structure and then augment it and refine it to the needs that they had. But of course, what we had to do, since there was no option, was to instead use groupings and then have the Brewski draft use the grouping from the voucher draft to create its own Yang data.
Okay, so maybe you can discuss it.
It was only possible because we had the foresight to do so. If we hadn't done that, then it would have been impossible.
In general, I would say it would be really useful to have Yang so that you can do things like this out of the box, so that Yang can be, we discussed it already several times before. So just to be able to use Yang for defining some structures that need not necessarily be in some network management protocol, data store, and things like that. But that's, of course, a long shot for now.
Okay.
A comment from Martin. Augment doesn't know anything about extensions.
Okay. The second open issue, currently there's no way to define special error info content for RPC or actions. Yang data could be used to define the structure, but should we also define a new extension statement that can be used to use an RPC and actions to refer to such a structure? And the example on the screen there, you can see where we have the map error info, which is then referring to a Yang data structure. And I think this would be necessary for the subscribe notifications or notification messages draft, right?
Yeah, Eric Voigt. In the NetConf working group, we have subscribed notifications and notification messages. We're definitely a user of the Yang data and all the elements that are up here. So we're very much supporting this, and this would help.
So that is the last slide. Again, there's actually two dependencies on this draft from the NetConf working group. Both the zero-touch draft and also the notification messages drafts are looking for this. Those are chartered working group items within the NetConf working group. And now this is essentially a dependency for them. So we would like to see this draft adopted by the working group, and maybe the chair can ask about that.
Subtle hint. Given that this is extension work, this is the logical place for the work. So I'm not going to ask the normal question of how many people think we should be solving this problem, because we already just established that there's another working group that really requires it. And the other option would be to kick this back to the other working group, and that's not really the right place for the work. So I'm going to jump right into how many people have read this draft. I'm sorry. Again, how many people? Okay, that's very few. We can jump to adoption, but well, why not? How many think we should be adopting this work into the working group? It's also very few. The interesting thing, it was more than read the document, but not by much. But that's sort of an interesting data point. Obviously, we'll take that information back and we'll talk about it and go from there. While we don't have obvious support for immediately going to adoption. Given that we have another working group that depends on it, my inclination would be to really try to bring this into the working group, because it seems like it's pretty important.
So Rob Wilton, Cisco. So I've not read this draft, but I do think this problem needs to be solved, and hence I support the adoption for it, because this is the right sort of solution. And any details can be worked out in the working group process. But I think we need to move this along quickly. It doesn't make sense to slow it down, is my opinion.
Yeah, actually, I normally phrase it as how many think that this is a good starting point for work in this area, and I failed to do that, and that would have been a better phrasing.
Too short. Christian Hobbs. You could also ask how many people think this should not be. That's always a good way to do it.
Okay, let's go for it. How many think we should not be working on this? 0. So that was useful. Thanks, Chris. Help from another seasoned chair. So with that, we'll move on to the next one. Okay, so unfortunately, because I was doing the poll, I missed a couple of comments on the last one. We have from Lada, who's in the room. I'm not going to read it. We have from Jürgen, the scope of the work remains unclear to me, and there's a little bit of a side discussion that goes on there, but I think it doesn't substantively change anything. So we have... Okay, great, thanks.
Thanks. Hi. In this draft, we we talk about finite state machine, Young model for finite state machine. We considered 3 use cases. The first one on to pre-instruct data plane devices in optical networks, in particular transponders, in case of optical physical layer degradation. So they can reconfigure their self in case of these degradations. The second use case is related to custom data probing for telemetry application. And the third use case is related to monitoring of packet loss and delay through a network clustering approach. So let's go to the first use case. At the state of the art, so the left part, we can consider an optical connection, assume a degradation. So a degradation can be revealed with a bit error rate increase above a threshold. An alarm is sent to the O&M handler. There is some transmission parameter computation, so consider the change of modulation format or forward error correction. The SDN controller reconfigures the transponders, and the recovery takes place. So this operation can be time consuming, especially if several optical connections are interested by the degradation. While we can do something different with considering a Young model for finite state machine, while the connection is still active, the SDN controller instructs the transponder on how to reconfigure itself, the transponder, in case of a degradation by installing a finite state machine. So if the degradation happens, the transponder already knows what to do, and the recovery can be faster. The second use case is related to telemetry. So we consider a dynamically customized network data collection instead of raw data extraction, in order with the aim of reducing the telemetry data bandwidth, taking advantage of in-network data processing. So in this scenario, we can consider that several network probes can be described as a finite state machine. An example is the congestion control. So let us assume two thresholds on the buffer depth. With these 2 thresholds, we can see 3 regions. The first one below the first threshold, then a second region between the 2 thresholds, and the third region above the second threshold. So each region can be associated with a state of the finite state machine. The third use case is related to the monitoring of performance measurements in multi-point to multi-point large networks. So we consider the multi-point to multi-point as a general case, but this can be applied also to point to point. Here, the SDN controller can orchestrate the performance measurements, and it can calibrate how going too deep into the monitoring data. We can assume the method of alternate marking for the performance measurement, and with this clustering approach, assume to divide the network in clusters. So if we have no particular problems of delay, we can consider large clusters. But we can go, when we have problems, we can go in more in deep, so with smaller clusters up to going to the flows. And again, here we can model, we can assume a finite state machine where each state represents a composition of clusters. So let's go to the model. we have a list of states. For example, considering the first use case of reconfiguration of transponders, we can have a state 0, which is the normal operation of the network. Then we have a list of transitions. One transition can be triggered by the bit error rate increase of the optical connection. A leaf of this list, transition list, is the filter to further express the transition. So in this case, we can put a threshold on the bit error rate, so that when the bit error rate is above this threshold, the transition is triggered. To the transition is associated an action, a list of actions. For example, the change of the modulation format to provide more robustness to the transmission, or the change of the forward error correction. And then we have the attribute execute, which actually calls an RPC that performs the task of modulation format change. So in summary, we presented the Young model for finite state machine. Please consider that this draft was presented in Prague in another working group. It was OPS WG. It receives comments to get it more generic model and including more use cases. So we included 2 more use cases, and we submitted here in NetMod. We have an implementation, and we also demonstrated in an integrated testbed of optical data plane and control plane the first use case. And as a next step, we'd like to ask for the adoption.
Comments, questions?
Galimberti from Cisco.
Lean in really close.
Galimberti from Cisco. Would it be possible to add also the output of the state machine related to the state instead of only to the transition? That would be make more general the work.
Yes, this can be done. Is something that we were thinking about. We can clarify this point in a new version of the draft. Thanks.
Thanks.
Christian Hops. Are these describing FSMs that exist already somewhere, or are these describing FSMs that you're also sort of proposing like vendors implement? Or
sorry, can you repeat the question?
Where are these finite state machines? Are you trying to describe ones that you feel are already there in the system, or are you describing new ones that?
No, well, we tried to describe a generic finite state machine, trying to include several use cases. So we have one use case brought by Huawei, and another use case brought by Telecom Italia, but the model aims to be generic.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, because there's an interesting use case of you could actually define a generic finite state machine that worked off of telemetry, and then, yeah, I mean, that would be cool.
Thanks.
It's Lou, just to follow up on that. But it seems that the way it's defined right now, you have to have the client has to have an understanding of what the server implements. And so, like, for instance, a name has to be something that's well known by both, right? Because you're triggering specific functions that you're trying to have the client trigger specific functions in the server, right?
Yes. These functions can be defined for example, in the list actions. These functions can be defined in some way there, as well as an event can be defined in the transition, the name, the type, the description, if I'm answering properly.
Yeah, I think so. I'm a little lost as to what the client is doing. That what flexibility is it really triggering? You know, it seems that it would have to have a representation of the finite state machine that's on the server, and all the degrees that are supported. And it's I don't know. I'm having a hard time understanding what this is getting at. But let's get to the line. And we have to wrap up in like 3 minutes. So, I'm sorry, 1 minute. So,
well, the point in our opinion, I don't know if there will be the right way. We can we try to make a generic model, and then inside the attributes we can define the things that the people wants to do with this model.
Okay.
So Rob Wilton, Cisco. So I've no idea whether there's going to be enough support in the room to adopt this or not. It's interesting to see, but I think it's generally useful to try and standardize these models so that if you've got similar functionality that multiple people want to use, it's nice to have one model, one way of doing it. So my question is, if there's not enough support in this room to adopt this, what happens then? I mean, is there another way that this could go in some other process, like it maybe goes on GitHub but goes into the Yang catalog so other people can use it?
Just because I'll shortcut it because the time, I don't think we have enough understanding in this room to do an adoption call. Okay. And you know, at most we can say how many people are interested in talking about this more or learning more. I don't think we can do more than that right now. I know I don't personally understand this enough to figure out whether it's a useful thing or completely, you know, something else.
So my question is, if there's not enough support, what's the next action?
If not supported, what?
I'm saying we're not going to ask that question today. In general, in the IETF, if we decide not to work on something, it goes wherever it goes. It's not for us to decide.
All right. Eric Voigt, just to put an offer out there, I know that the Igor Briskin, is that how you say his name? He was looking at something called event condition action as a problem statement in the netconf added to the subscription and the telemetry work there. I'm sure he'd like to chat with you about a problem statement. If you're looking to help define what's needed for this group, a joint problem statement would be pretty good.
Yeah, that's a really good suggestion. Igor's not here this time, but maybe reach out to him and see if he'd be interested in collaborating with you.
Okay.
Igor Briskin.
Okay, thank you.
And if you can't find it, just send me mail.
Okay, thank you.
This is Alex Klemmer. I had basically the same questions or the same comment, because I think actually that automation framework is related to what you're trying to do here as well. So I think we should.
Okay.
Can the next presenter, Xiao Jin?
Thank you.
Art Yang model, Xiao Jin? Am I mispronouncing the name? I'm sorry.
Is there someone here to present on this model?
The ARP Yang model?
Okay, then.
We have your slides.
Okay. So this is something that I heard is actually being presented also in routing working group. Maybe they decided that that's a better place for it. I don't really know. Please.
Yeah. Just go over the slides. Just help you.
And just like a couple.
Okay.
Of
Obviously, my colleague not here, and I'm Michael Wang from Huawei, and I help to you to go through this slide. And if you have any comments, please send the email to the author.
Excuse me. It's remote. We didn't realize.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Shelton. Can't hear you just yet.
Hello?
Okay, I think we can hear you.
Can you hear me? Hi, Xiaojian. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, please.
I'm here. Okay, let's start.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead. Just let us know when we flip slides.
Yeah.
Okay. What's the next state problem? So for the IP protocol, several vendors have their own private YARN modules to implement the ARP functions, such as Cisco, Juniper, and Huawei. Such private YARN module can well applied onto their own devices. However, due to the different functions of the device, providing YARN module is hard to use across the devices and cannot meet the demand of common requirements of user. So in this case, imagine a scenario that a service provider manages the thousands of devices, and these devices are from many vendors. It must be a disaster if there is no way to control this device in a standard way. So a solution can be extract some common properties within a device implementing the RPC. This method has two meanings. The first one is provide a unique identifier for RP configuration function. For example, the agent. So the agent in some private YARN module is called the timeout or the expire time, and we summarize a common name, the agent, and the similar is the interval. It is sometimes called the detector interval or it is called the ARP interval. So we can give a unique name, so the user cannot be confused by these similar names. And the second is we provide the common properties. For example, the static ARP entry, the dynamic ARP entries, and the proxy ARP. Okay, this function is well defined in ARP protocol. So next slide, please. Hello? Yeah. So here in this draft, we summarize the four features of ARP configuration functions of the static ARP entry, the dynamic learning of ARP entry, the proxy ARP, and the gratuitous ARP. So we can see the tree diagram, the container ARP static table list of static ARP configuration. So the leaf expire time describes the aging time of the dynamic ARP entry. The leaf ARP name describes whether the dynamic ARP learning is disabled. So it is enabled by default, and the ARP proxy describes whether the proxy ARP is disabled. So it is also enabled by default. And the ARP prop grouping describes the common configuration of all ARP prop. So the leaf prop interval means the intervals of detecting the dynamic ARP entries. And the leaf prop times is the number of engine prop attempts for a dynamic ARP entry. The unicast means whether use of unicast mode to send an ARP aging prop message for a dynamic ARP entry. So it is also enabled by default. And finally, the ARP gratuitous grouping describes the configuration gratuitous ARP. So the container ARP if limits, it is describes the maximum number of dynamic ARP entries that interface can learn. So next slide, please. So the next steps, first align with other models. Here we will mention the comments of Alex from the demo mail list. So Alex says the published model IETF RP, it is also called the RPC 7277. It is overlaps the data being provided in this model, and he gives some suggestions to avoid the duplication of data where possible. So we thank the Alex for these valuable questions, and we will revise the we have replied the corresponding answer in the posted on the list. So, and we will revise the draft in the next version. And here we also want to the more solid comments. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Our understanding is you've also presented this work or are going to present this work in the routing working group. Do you have a feeling as to which place you think is more appropriate? And I understand that that's as much a discussion for chairs and ADs, but I'd like to hear your opinion.
Xiaojin, we'd only hear you. That was a question for you.
Sorry, the voice is not very good. I cannot hear you.
Sorry, let me try again. Are you presenting this also in the routing working group?
Yes, I will present it into the IETF working group tomorrow.
Do you think it belongs, that work should be done there or here in this working group?
Yeah.
Maybe I'll talk with the chair after you present there. Thank you very much. We appreciate you giving us this presentation.
Yes, clear.
Okay, with that, we are finished. Thank you for lasting through these two sessions and giving us some good discussions. With that, we'll see you in London.